Welcome again, everyone, to another episode of Resilient Health Radio. I'm your host, Dr. Darin Ingels, and joining me on the podcast today is Dr. Partha Nandi. He is a board-certified gastroenterologist. He's the host of the Emmy-winning Ask Dr. Nandi television show, author of several books, and his latest book, Heal Your Gut, Save Your Brain, is coming out soon, I believe October 1st of this year. So, Dr. Nandi, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Oh, thanks for having me. We talked before, and it's a pleasure and honor to be with you. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I'm so excited to have an actual gastroenterologist on the podcast. In naturopathic medicine, we put so much emphasis on the importance of the gut, and it controls so much. And of course, with all the research that's been coming out the last several decades, how it ties into mood and autoimmunity outside of the normal gastroenterology things we think of, like IBS and Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis. It's really kind of the cornerstone of health. So I just appreciate someone like you who's got a foot in, the conventional world and sort of the functional medicine world that really understands how all this ties into the whole body.
Yeah, it's not that long ago that when you talked about leaky gut, you get the big eye roll from most
Yeah.
Western medicine doctors. Then we renamed it, intestinal permeability,
Yeah.
and now it's all acceptable. It's a little weird how things go, but no, I agree that it's nice to be able to kind of do a little bit of both, So absolutely, it's good to be with you and talk about that.
It's funny. I can remember going to get a colonoscopy several years ago with my doctor in Connecticut, and I knew the answer to the question. I said, "Look, how much do you think gut health really is involved in total health?" And he said, "Well, outside of celiac disease, I don't think it's a big deal." I'm like, "Okay." So I thought that was pretty interesting. So all the stuff that goes in your mouth and through your gut really has nothing to do with anything else. But okay, I thought that was interesting.
And that's how people thought, and that's what's really terrible. We now know, as you know, right, that basically almost every disease state you can now connect to the gut in some way. It's not, I mean, listen, it's not a panacea, it's not the only thing, but it's more and more. I almost backed into it, right? So I'm a gastroenterologist because back when I was, a couple of decades ago when I went into it, I thought it's great because you develop a relationship with patients because it's a medicine of portion of it where you're talking to patients, giving them therapy, getting a relationship, which I love. And you have procedures where somebody comes in with a big bleed and you stop it, and and it's done. So I love that. But then little did I know this many years later that we'd be talking about the gut for something like the brain. It's really interesting how things work out sometimes.
Well, can you talk a little bit about that gut-brain axis? How are the two really interconnected? I don't think people understand that connection.
Yeah, it really started, and I'll tell you briefly about my dad. My dad was kind of my first hero, Dr. Ingels, and he was a brilliant scientist, always there for me. And then one day, as when I was a doc by then, but one day he had a massive stroke, totally healthy, never in the hospital before. Typical guy. He didn't need particularly badly, but he didn't need particularly well either. And one day he just had a stroke, and the last decade of his life was spent, having people change his he had a diaper, and basically all the activities of daily living had to be done by other people. And I was kind of shocked. I said to myself, what are we missing? And what am I missing? He wasn't hypertensive, didn't have any increased risk for cardiovascular disease. And then at the time when he had this has been now, I'd say, what, 15 years ago, maybe, and I didn't really realize anything that I could offer. But then fast forward and leading to your question, I now know that there's so many connections between the gut and the brain. Had I known then what I know now, but a different story. I would have told my dad, hey, you know what? We got to pay attention to your gut. Why are you doing this? Why are you doing that? And so the gut brain axis is so important. And to me, the gut and the brain are like two teenagers that are talking right before and after a Taylor Swift concert. They are constantly texting each other, right? They're constantly in communication with each other, and there are multiple ways that they do this action. The biggest one is, as you know, and for your listeners and people who are watching, is the vagus nerve, right? It's a super highway of information. Stuff is going back and forth. It's bi-directional. So information is coming from the gut to the brain. And so when we say, we have a gut, I have a gut feeling, when I have butterflies in the stomach, these are not just sayings. you have connections from the gut that gives you, if you have an emotion of that there's danger, you feel it in the gut, and the gut changes blood supply based on that. When you feel danger, the gut gets ready to be able to be in survival mode. Vice versa, if you don't take care of your gut and the gut is not healthy, the signals that go to your brain through the vagus nerve are not always positive. So there's first is the vagus nerve. The second is we have these neurotransmitters, just a fancy word of chemicals that really affect how the brain works, right? So one of the things I tell my patients and even my kids sometimes that, listen, you think that your thoughts are your own, right? We think that our thoughts and how we feel are as personal as possible. I said, what if I tell you if I change the concentration of the neurotransmitter, the way you think will be different, right? And it's to me, it's a little startling to people when they think, wow, if I can change the amount of serotonin in my body or dopamine or GABA, it could change things. And the gut, for example, is responsible for 95% of the serotonin production. And so if you didn't have that, or if you had that not giving the same concentration you're supposed to, it can affect your brain. Same with the other products that the gut makes. They make short chain fatty acids. That helps to really be able to get the gut wall, and we'll talk about that more, to have integrity. So there's the neurotransmitters. A third way that the gut and the brain work, and communicate is really through the barrier that the gut has, right? So the between stool and blood is one cell layer thick, and that allows stuff in the stool not in the blood. If you start getting things that leak into the blood from the gut, right? So it's not big particles of stool that's going through, but little tiny macromolecules like proteins, part of bacteria that go in. It starts inflammation. That inflammation, if it continues on, goes and actually can affect what's called a blood-brain barrier. And the blood-brain barrier, then, if it's broken, think of it as cheesecloth, right? You're trying to strain things through. The cheesecloth's got an opening, stuff is going to get through. If it gets in the brain, that's huge, because then the brain starts increasing inflammation. That inflammation can lead to diseases like, for example, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, even predispose you or increase you for diseases like MS and stroke. So there's the gut is super important to be able to do it. The last thing I'll tell you about the gut is this trillion member plus army that we have, right? And it's kind of a catchphrase, or people talk about this in social media now. Microbiome. So what does that mean? You got trillions of bugs, not just bacteria, but bacteria, virus, fungi, protozoa, all there working in concert. We have to know that these bugs predate us by millions of years. So 15 million years ago, before we are even in the form that we're in now, these bugs existed. As evolution went through, these bugs got incorporated into us. So it's a symbiotic relationship. So we work together. The bugs require us to give them food. We move around, we poop them out, and get them going throughout all of nature. And we depend on them to produce factors that help us live. The gut has the most complex immune system in the entire body, right? Because it needs to make sure what comes in into your gut stays in there, doesn't go elsewhere, like I talked about. It has the best border patrol there is in nature, right? Because it has to prevent stuff from going through. So you got the CIA, the Army, the Navy, everybody at the border, and the gut microbiome is responsible for making sure that stays in concert. It's also, the gut has probably the second most complex neurological system. In the wall of the gut, you got these nerves that really control the movement of the gut, but it also can communicate with the brain, and the microbiome, the composition can really affect that. So the gut and the brain are intricate connections, some direct, some less direct, but really they work together. Probably of all the organs that the gut is in communication with, the brain is probably the number one organ that it communicates with. They're very intimate. And we used to think of gut as a dumb organ, meaning dumb in the sense that we would just digest foods, poop out, that's the end of it. Now we know so much more. Your very astute question to your doctor, the gastroenterologist, hey, is it affecting multiple parts of your body? On 110%. Your guts at the center. And this is something that Ayurvedic medicine thousands of years ago knew, Greek medicine, this is not something new. We just forgot it because now we're modern. nothing wrong with modern medicine, right? I'm part of it, but we've forgotten some of our traditions. So.
Yeah, I think it's been interesting with all the, I mean, literally just, I mean, every year, I mean, hundreds, if not thousands of studies coming out on the impact of the microbiome on various diseases. You know, I'm somebody living with multiple sclerosis, and there, I mean, is a plethora of studies on very specific changes in the microbiome that have been associated with MS. Now, is it cause or effect? I don't think we've quite elucidated that. But again, we can see this with diabetes. We can see it with, weight changes. We can see it with, I think, some of the neuropsychiatric effects of the gut microbiome is grossly overlooked, certainly in the psychiatric world. And if someone comes in with, battling depression, I don't know that the psychiatrist even thinks that, hey, maybe this is really stemming from a gut problem.
100%. And you're not having the gastroenterologist asking anything about any other symptoms, right? Because unfortunately, American medicine, and me being part of it, Western medicine, you come in, you got like 5 minutes, you're out, right? Nobody's asking any questions or connecting the dots. And the problem is that if you do connect the dots, you probably will get to the root cause and solve the problem quicker, but we're not doing that. The psychiatrist, neurologist is not asking about your diet or your bowel movements or any symptoms that you have that may point in the right direction. You're absolutely right. And there's so many diseases. We're talking today about the gut and the brain, but the gut and the heart have connections. The gut and joints have connections. I mean, I'll tell you, I have family members that if they eat the wrong thing, they have joint pains. And I mean, almost disabling joint pains. And we're just not talking about that. And I think medicine in 25 years, Dr. Ingels, will be unrecognizable from what it is today, because I mean, in every field, you see all over the world, not just the US, we're getting research that show gut health, gut microbiome is going to be intimately responsible for good health.
We've got a lot of really, I'll say, new and emerging information around genetics and certainly how that impacts the gut and the microbiome. Can you talk a little bit about specifically this ApoE4 genotype?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? The APOE4 genotype is connected with a risk for Alzheimer's disease, right? So what happens is that you have a specific type of microbiome. If you look at folks with Alzheimer's, there's almost something called the Alzheimer's gut. And what the Alzheimer's gut shows is that when you look at the microbiome, the signature of bugs that are in the system for patients on the whole with Alzheimer's versus not, they are a specific subtype to a point where researchers almost call it an Alzheimer's gut. So what does it have to do with the ApoE4? Well, the products that these gut bugs actually produce are called postbiotics. So I'll go back. Prebiotics are the food for these bugs, right? So usually it's fibers, fruits, garlic, onion, leeks. So the bugs love to eat. Why are they important? Because if you don't feed the bugs, right, they will not proliferate, especially when you're trying to change the equation. If you're trying to take probiotics or foods that have probiotics, then you need to have food that can then make those probiotics or bacteria grow. So prebiotics, the food, probiotics are the actual bugs themselves, right? Typically for us, they're bacteria. That's what we usually refer to most of the microbiome. But in the gut itself, there's many different types. There's viruses, protozoa, fungi, etc. But the probiotics are the actual bugs. The postbiotics, right, are the products that they create. So we create the microbiome creates multiple products, and some of them are actually responsible or associated with genetic products that. So remember, when you have genes, the genes get transcribed and they create proteins and they create products. We now see that certain types of microbiomes, especially in Alzheimer's disease, produce certain proteins or lack of certain, for example, short chain fatty acids. One of the things that the microbiome or the gut microbiome doesn't do in people with diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, it doesn't produce short chain fatty acids. Why does that matter? Short chain fatty acids are super important to prevent stuff from going from your gut into the blood, and then that produces inflammation. So the concept here is that when you have those kinds of patterns, and as you talked about, Dr. Ingels, even with MS, and we don't all understand everything, but we know the associations. When you see that, then could you perhaps change the equation, change your gut health, change your microbiome? And the easiest way to do that, right, to me, is what you put in your mouth, right? Diet or food, not a diet plan, but the foods that you give your microbiome and your gut and your gut wall to be able to be healthy. When it's healthy, it works in concert. If it's not, you've got disarray. Right now, in the Western world, we have every 3 seconds somebody's being diagnosed with dementia. Every 6 seconds, someone's being diagnosed with Alzheimer's. Every 4 minutes, somebody's dying with a stroke. So it is not a theoretical problem anymore. It is a crisis, and it's like an Olympic. Like I use this analogy. It's like an Olympic skier. Well, if you've seen those Winter Olympics, it's skyrocketing. It's not just going up gradually. It's now exponentially increasing because the wonderful Western diet, Dr. Ingels, is loved by everybody. I remember going to an airport in New Delhi, and I saw this big. I said, this must be the best restaurant because there's so many crowds there. It was KFC. Listen, I'm not trying to point out KFC, but it's this processed food generation. That's why worldwide now you're getting things like Alzheimer's. So diet is the number one thing you can do. But to me, it's more than just diet. I use a 5-pillar methodology that I tell people when you have, if you're thinking about having diseases like Alzheimer's, and people go, well, who is that? That's everybody. Because listen, if you haven't gotten a heart attack or been disabled by some disease or been struck by cancer, what do you worry about? It's your mind, right? I mean, how many folks do you know that are otherwise healthy and then they get MS, stroke, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's? So to me, it's really everybody like me who is, knock on wood, not at a heart attack, not at any horrific things happen. It's really talking about your mental health. So what can you do? Diet is number one. The other pill that I struggled with for a long time is living a purpose-driven life. And people say, well, what does that have to do with gut health or anything? Well, when you have a purpose-driven life, not less than 7 studies that show that you can decrease most of the common causes of death, cardiovascular disease, stroke, and it also impacts gut health. Why? Because when you have a purpose-driven life, we now know that you don't have this activation of what's called the fight or flight response, right? When people are purpose-driven, right? When they are focused and they're not aimlessly wandering, you don't have the unrest, and that leads to what? Decreased cortisol production, decreased innervation of all your hormones that get you up. And studies have now shown that impacts your gut microbiome, that impacts your gut health. The third pillar to me is movement. There's so many of my patients that just sit on their butt. Hope I can use that word here, but sit on their behind ordering DoorDash and not even moving, right? Not doing anything. And we're creatures of movement. When you move, your gastrointestinal tract, your gut health changes. Why? Because the GI tract is a muscular organ. When you're moving, it also moves. And what also happens is that you get energy homeostasis. In English, that means that your blood is now flowing into your GI tract. You're creating enough energy for the right concentration of the bugs to be able to be living and thriving. So movement does more than just move your body. It moves and it energizes your gut. The fourth pillar is important to me, is just as much as anybody else, and any others, is community. When you are working like you are in this community, when everybody's listening and working together, again, we've seen multiple studies. The most famous one is the Rossetto effect. The Rossetto effect talks about a community in Pennsylvania in the 1950s. You probably already know about this, Dr. Ingels, that thrived because the only difference they had was the community they were in. They would eat together, cook together, play together, and it was an Italian immigrant community. And in that community, heart attacks were almost non-existent. People were living to their 90s. Nothing else was different about them except the fact that they had community. And what community does is the same thing I talked to you about, purpose-driven living. And it decreases the flight or fight response, decreases inflammation, improves gut and brain health. The last one to me in this 5-pillar method is spirituality. So does that mean praying? It can be. Doesn't mean that you have to pray though. Any kind of mindfulness, yogas, any Tai Chi, all of that will be able to enhance brain and gut health. So I look at approaching great gut health and then consequently great brain health by using those 5 pillars. People understand the diet and food and nutrition pretty easily because you put it in your body, and it's probably the most important factor. But I think we can approach this in this really holistic manner, and I think it can be successful.
I really appreciate you talk about the purpose-driven life. I see this a lot in my older patients, particularly when they retire. They lose that sense of purpose. My own father did this. He retired, I think, fairly young, and he was bored to tears for about 6 months. And he said, he's like, I didn't feel like I had purpose anymore. And he went back to work and he loves it. And I think so many people, particularly at least at that age, that tends to be a common problem. So yeah, you don't have a purpose, and maybe you're lacking that community again. Your coworkers and people you used to engage with. I think this is really a common, certainly an American problem when people get older and they start retiring. That if they don't have that sense of community, they don't have that purpose anymore. We see all sorts of health things kind of fall in line after that.
100% increased longevity, the whole bit. I think it, and it doesn't have to. People will say, "Well, I gotta have a huge purpose." No, I mean, whatever your purpose is, doesn't have to save the planet. It can be being the best parent, being the best of whatever you do. And I think that really we don't talk about that enough, because when you have that, you'll see people that are very healthy are pretty purpose driven. They're not. You don't hear them say, "Oh, I just have no idea what I'm going to do. I'm just, everything is terrible." Typically, people that are healthy, and not just healthy in the sense that their blood tests are healthy, but they're joyful, they're actually enjoying life. They're not telling you that they don't know what they want. They typically have a pretty enjoyable and driven life. And that's what I try to, it's hard when you have patients that come to you with symptoms as a gastroenterologist on my traditional practice, like I've got bloating, to tell them to let's go back and see, hey, what do you enjoy your job? How's your marriage? These are things that may not be obvious, but if you're constantly thinking about why my husband or wife yells all the time, or why my boss is making me do this, that unrest, right? The gut brain connection, that connection between the vagus nerve, between the gut and the brain, is activated. And so, in this book, we talk about methodologies in which you can really approach that in a realistic way, and not, some pie in the sky academic, textbook where nobody can do it. You can take actionable steps that really can change to make the difference.
I run this across this in my practice all the time. I think there is a lot of discrepancy of what is normal gut function. I just, as an example, I had a child come in my practice who was having one bowel movement a week, and the pediatrician said, perfectly normal. I'm like, on what planet do you think pooping once a week, if you're eating 3 times a day, is normal? Can you just, share your insight on, I guess maybe what are those red flags people should be looking out for that your gut really isn't functioning as well as it should be?
Yeah, and you talked about one, the frequency. And what happens is your body is very, very smart. I will tell you, if you're going once a week and you're starting to feel discomfort, right? You feel bloated, that's the number one thing. You know that there's something that's gone awry. So the gut motility is likely changed. You may have a condition even called small intestinal bacterial overgrowth that is changing. Remember, when you have excessive amounts of bugs as well that are not healthy, they change the movement of the intestine because of the factors that it creates. So symptoms as far as how well your bowels are moving, symptoms, of course, abdominal pain, nausea, also brain fog. Like, people will say, well, I can't really concentrate. I had a man, Dr. Ingels, just last week, as an executive. He said, I can't even concentrate in any of my meetings. This guy runs a company. He says, I just want to crawl and go into, a quiet room and just rest. So the clues are not just the nausea, bloating, abdominal pain. You can have diarrhea or constipation. Sometimes you can even have blood in your intestinal system. All those are absolute number one, two, three, reasons why you should say, hey, you know what, there's something wrong with my gut, and see a doctor like myself, and make sure there's nothing, like a bleeding ulcer or some colitis or a polyp, but make sure you see somebody. But also things like being more forgetful, right? And not being able to concentrate. This whole idea behind having brain fog, having headaches, more often. So these are all signs that your gut may not be in the right shape. And so when you have that happen, what do you do? Well, before we didn't have any testing. Now we actually have tests of your microbiome that you can do that are relatively objective. There's a couple of systems. I like the biome system where they tell you, what kinds of uh, gut bacteria that you have, what your gut microbiome is. And maybe for you, broccoli may not be the right choice, right? Maybe it's kale, or maybe it's cauliflower, or maybe it's spinach, whatever it is. So it's nice to be able to be a little bit more um, get therapy that's tailor made, because we give a lot of very general recommendations because we're so early in this idea of what the gut health is about and what the microbiome is about. But we're getting more and more specific, at least as far as the diet and what we're missing, right? You can, I'm sure in the future we'll have tests that really measure how well the gut wall integrity is, meaning that are we starting to have things go through? We're starting to get some clues when you see substances that actually are leaking out and we can measure them. But my point is that I think when you have these symptoms, like we talked about, obviously see your doctor, make sure there's nothing obvious that's wrong, like an ulcer, like a colon polyp, colon cancer, colitis, those types of. But when you exclude that, remember you can also look at functional gut health, like I talked about, changes in your microbiome, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, leaky gut. All of these things can really play a big role in your digestive and your digest tract and your central nervous system, along with other organs. But we're talking about the brain; it can really affect your brain.
Well, your new book, Heal Your Gut, Save Your Brain, I know comes out October 1st. It's available for pre-order, so we're going to put the link in the show notes for that. What do you really, I mean, you said, this was a labor of love. What do you really want people to take home from this book?
I want people to know that, listen, that you can impact and change your gut health very easily. And you can do it using the 5 pillars. Why that's important is because then you have the power to change your health, right? It's not that it's, my mom or my dad and uncle had this disease and I'm destined to fail like them. You now have the power of health in your hands. And that's what we all kind of talk about. And so to me, that's called being a health hero, and that you can make changes that change your destiny. So, for example, Alzheimer's, you don't have to get Alzheimer's. Now we know that Alzheimer's is not just a disease that you're getting too old, but it's actually a disease of inflammation where you have so many inflammatory factors that your brain is increasing the inflammation inappropriately, and that's causing these things like neurofibrillary tangles where neurons cannot live together and they can't communicate. Neurons are dying. Those are the cells in your brain. So when you come back to what you can do about these things, you can change before you have the symptoms of Alzheimer's, change your gut for the better. I would say first, eat whole foods, right? Make sure that you get adequate hydration, eat whole foods, do the unthinkable, go in your kitchen and actually cook, right? Instead of ordering out. So easy now. We have so many options to call DoorDash. You can take your rolling chair and roll down to the door and then pick up the food and go on your TV or this sucker, this smartphone, and look at TikTok all day. So instead of that, go into your kitchen and cook food, cook whole foods. That is one of the most powerful things you can do, because it adds, when you cook with your family, for example, it creates community, it increases spirituality, and your kids will love it because that's the best tasting food they'll have. So when you have the knowledge that these diseases can be related to your gut health and you can change it, then you have the power of your health in your hands. We talk about in the book is that make one change a day in each of the pillars. So try to figure out what you can do to increase a purpose-driven life. Figure out activities that are really not contributing to your purpose-driven life. A lot of it may be just aimlessly looking at this thing where you're looking at what everybody else is doing, and maybe cut that out and put in more activities that is purpose driven. That's one activity, right? If you're talking about food, maybe think about every day incorporating more fermented foods. We didn't talk about this, Dr. Ingles, but fermented foods have probiotics, right? So if you like sauerkraut, if you like yogurt, if you like kimchi, if you like kombucha, there's so many foods in every culture that has probiotics. Maybe incorporate that one food, once a day or twice a day, if you could incorporate that into your daily life. So you make one step in each of these 5 pillars. I guarantee you, within weeks, your life will change, not just your gut health, but your overall health. But clearly, you'll see more regularity as you put in more natural probiotics. You can also add supplements. I'm not against that at all. I think if you could add a supplement with a pre and probiotic, you can change the equation. You can make these simple changes every day. if you don't have, people say, well, I'm not married, I'm single, I'm in a new city. What do you mean community? Well, community can be from work, it can be from a hobby that you're doing, and if you want, it can be even online. Gives you that support that you need to be able to really support your health and support your goals. And then last thing is spirituality. Figure out some spiritual exercise, whatever it is. It doesn't mean you have to, sit cross-legged in some uncomfortable position on top of a mountain, right? It could just be taking a walk in the garden, or doing something that involves having you understand your place in the planet, right? So if it's for me, it's meditation. I meditate at least 5 minutes a day, and it may not seem like a lot, but think about the last time you actually stopped and the only thing you thought about was your breath. 99% of people have not done that in, forget about days, weeks, months, years. If you just stop and even think about your breath, what happens is that you're not thinking about all the other activities that cause you unrest. So if you do one of those activities each day from each pillar, it changes the entire equation, and it puts the power back of good health in your own hands. I've seen it, with police officers. I've seen it with fellow physicians and attorneys and teachers and people that are that are working in the factories. It really works for all walks of life, and it's so important to have that power back in your hands to be able to enhance your gut and your brain. So that's what I'd like people to know, that they have the power to be able to succeed, and it's not some gigantic program or horrible hard thing to do. It's pretty simple and it's achievable.
Well, that's fantastic. I mean, that's the whole goal of this podcast, is to really help empower people to take your health back, to give you the tools and things you can do on your own. You don't have to rely on your doctor to do everything for you. There's so much low-hanging fruit that's easy, accessible, not going to break the piggy bank, that, like you said, that small incremental change is cumulative and over time. I mean, I always think of the economist that says the story. It's like, if you put a nickel away from the time you're 5 years old, by the time you're 60, it's $1 million. And you say, but it's only a nickel. I'm like, right, but there's that cumulative benefit as it adds over time. So these little changes that you're talking about may not feel like much from day to day, but over the course of weeks, months, and certainly years, you're going to reap the benefits of all that hard work. So I appreciate you sharing that. Can't wait for the book. I said I placed the order of the book for myself. I'll be excited to read it when it comes out in October. And again, I'm just grateful that you spent some time with us today. So thank you so much, Dr. Nandi.
Oh, thanks for your time. Appreciate it. Yeah.